everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of Hot SciComm Summer, a special podcast series about science communication. Last week, we heard from Dan Pink, who is a professional writer who writes books that use social science research to convey interesting ideas to the public. But it seems to have become increasingly common for professors, the scientists themselves, to write books for the public. I'll be honest, it's something I have an interest in doing myself. But where the heck do you start? When you're juggling running a lab, writing articles for peer-reviewed journals, teaching classes, upholding service obligations, how could you take on the monumental task of going from a blank screen to having a book that you've written pop up in a local bookstore? And maybe more importantly, should you do this? Like, when is that actually a good idea? This week, I talked to Vanessa Bohns, who's a social psychologist and professor at Cornell University, where she studies social influence. I've been a longtime fan of her work, and almost 2 years ago, I invited her to talk about it on Opinion Science. When I talked to her then, she had just finished writing the manuscript for her book, You Have More Influence Than You Think, which came out late in 2021. And the book is great. I have to say, I read plenty of popular social science books, probably more than I should. And I really liked how Vanessa went about weaving her own research with other work in the field and tying it to things that matter in our everyday experience. It was certainly one of my favorites of the books for the public by academics variety. So I asked Vanessa if she'd come back on the podcast, this time to talk nuts and bolts of why she decided to write the book, how she went about doing so, and advice she has for other people considering doing the same thing. I also wanted to get her take on another aspect of all of this, which is promoting the book. I had noticed that she was appearing on a ton of podcasts and other digital media talking about the book, and she's very good at it. But how do you do that? Like, I imagine Hollywood stars get some training on doing press junkets, but at least for me, being interviewed for podcasts never came up in my graduate training. Anyhow, Vanessa is great. She's got great insight on the process and was very cool to be so open about her experience. So let's jump in. Okie doke. Yeah, so let's talk about writing books.
Yeah.
I kind of think that we can. So the way that I was thinking of it is kind of breaking it into three sort of stages, right? Sort of the prep and planning and idea and should I do this? The actual what does it take to sit down and write one of these things? And then the tail end, which is it's not over when the book hits the shelf because then you have to go talk to a bunch of people. Do you have any idea? Have you counted the number of promo interviews you've done for the book?
I haven't, but I mean, it's just so many.
It's so many. Yeah. I noticed, I mean, I felt very happy because I was like, well, I talked to her a year before the book came out.
Yeah.
And then I just saw you going on the circuit. And I mean, it's great because the feedback seemed to be really great that like people were really interested in having you on because the book resonated with so many people.
Yeah.
But man, you were busy.
And it's still going. Like it just doesn't stop. And some still haven't come out yet. And yeah.
How do you balance that with your actual job?
Definitely for the first month or two, it totally took over the job. You know, I could do my classes, do the meetings that like my graduate students needed, but anything extra, it was just time spent recording podcasts, especially because, you know, I'm like a 9 to 5er because I have to pick up the kids and drop the kids off. So it's like, that's the time I have. Yeah. So I had like the recording sign on the door of my office constantly.
And I mean, the nice thing is that you could do that in a remote world. Like ordinarily, would you have been like going places to do some of this work?
I think some of it, yeah. And I think that I would have said no to a lot of things because I don't like traveling that much with the kids and it would have been, you know, too much. So I think I got to do so much more promotion because of the remote world. And I will say, you know, in some ways it forced me to think about my research in a different way that's been helpful, like what resonates with like ordinary people about this research, which, I mean, we get so involved in our academic, you know, bubble that we're always thinking like, what will academics respond to in this research? And hearing all these ideas from ordinary people, I'm like, oh yeah, I never thought of that about that because it doesn't have like a necessarily theoretical relevance, you know, but it's practically important and I should think about it.
What have you been surprised to learn that people resonate with?
I mean, I guess I shouldn't be that surprised, but like some of the most just I feel like kind of basic findings, like asking for things face to face over email, like that has always
Hmm.
been such a huge thing for people that they really, cling to. And for me, it's like, it just seems kind of obvious. And it followed so clearly from the theory.
Hmm.
And I don't know, but people like really take that to heart. And then, I was surprised that there's some findings that we just take for granted that have been around forever, like the spotlight effect, right? The Barry Manilow t-shirt study. I can't believe how many people at least talked about that study like they had never heard it before, and were just super drawn to it and found it fascinating. And so while I love that study, and I think lots of people reassure themselves with that study that people aren't paying attention to the things that we're embarrassed by, I was surprised just like how much I was telling people, felt like I was telling people something new with like an old study.
Hmm. So one of the people I talked to for this series is a guy he's a grad student and has been like a TikTok sensation. He's got like 1 million TikTok followers, and he basically, a lot of them are the kinds of psych studies that you go, "Well, don't we all, everybody has heard about that one." But his point was interesting because he was like, well, I'm catching like teenagers and like young kids on this platform who don't even really know that psychology is a thing you can study and have never heard of these things. And so it's this opportunity that we sort of ignore as professors. We go like, oh, well, they learned that in intro psych, so I won't touch it in my class. You go, well, no, it's like not every person in the world has taken intro psych and knows some of these core things. And to me, that strikes me as the fundamental challenge of science communication from the academic's perspective, right? Like, I feel like your job is almost easier if you're a journalist who's kind of just like picking up a topic just for the sake of a piece. You learn it and you sort of are in touch with the you that you were before you learned that stuff. Whereas, when you write this book, you go, well, I've known this finding for years. I've known the basic premise of this for years. And so all of that seems obvious. And so it's interesting that you might then think, well, oh, here's the cool new part that everyone's going to be excited about. And no one cares about that because they go, wait a minute, you're telling me that people don't realize that I'm wearing this shirt if I am focused on it myself. So
Yeah, totally.
I guess then just to pivot, like, where does the desire come from to kind of take those steps back and say, let's actually take all this work that I've been doing and present it outside of this environment that I've been doing it in? So that first question of like, why would a person even decide to write a book for the public? What was that thought process for you?
I mean, for me, I think I had always wanted to write a book, for almost as long as I can remember. I was like starting and stopping books, like, obnoxious, like 20-year-old walking through New York City and putting my thoughts down type books
Mm.
where I was like, no one would ever care about this. So there was just a general, like, this is a life goal, was to write a book. And then at some point, I felt like I actually had something to say and had accumulated enough sort of unique knowledge and had a unique perspective, that felt like, evidence backed, that I felt sort of qualified to be able to write a book. But I think, I mean, it's an interesting point, this idea of like stepping back, because I do think it's given me a perspective on, our field that you start to lose. Like we were saying, you forget what people know and don't know. And, you know, you don't, you stop realizing what resonates with humans who are the people we're actually studying, because we get so involved in our theories and our theoretical debates and empirical debates and all this stuff. And so I definitely feel like I've learned so much about my phenomena that I study from hearing how other people respond to it. In some ways, knowing that, like, okay, this is important, even if, I feel like each sort of addition is incremental at this point, like theoretically, like practically, people are asking these questions.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and just getting a sense of like, we know certain findings that are reassuring to people, and it feels good to be like, actually, you know, it's not as bad as you're worrying about, in my particular case.
Has it changed the research that you're doing?
I don't know that it's changed it, but it's definitely like through not just the book, but like all my popular writing has definitely made me realize, like, for example, my graduate student and I had the, as I mentioned, face to face versus email. study, and that, there were big findings. It was way more effective to ask for things face to face. And people resonated with that so much that it really, theoretically, I kind of felt like I kind of answered the questions I have about this, but people really wanted to know, okay, well, how does that compare to the phone? How does that compare to like these very practical sorts of
Hmm.
questions? And so we went and did that follow up. And I do think that, again, there's like this incremental theoretical contribution from that, but like the practical contribution is so much bigger. And so I probably wouldn't have sort of emphasized that project as and treat it as such a priority project. It was driven by my graduate student, Maddie Rogan, I said, but I think I made it a real priority myself because I knew that people wanted to know that the answer to that question.
To go back to the why question, so you said you'd always just writing a book was something of interest, but why? Let's go further back than that. Like, why? What is it about writing a book that has any bearing on on the world?
I know. I figured you would ask this, and I was trying to reflect on it. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of the things that I like read in college or in graduate school, like a lot of I remember reading certain books that really resonated with me or changed my perspective or, got me into psychology. And so there's that, I guess, like there's this connection of like that was a meaningful thing in my life. Could I make something like that? Um I don't know. I don't know what it is. There just always seemed to be something special about a book. Like
Hmm.
it was just like this tangible thing that only certain people could make or something. That was also within reach. Like it's not like I'm going to make a
Hmm.
movie,
Right.
but
As much as you
um,
like movies.
I know exactly. But yeah, I always loved writing, and I think that is a thing. Like if you hate writing, I think it's a different kind of calculus
Mm-hmm.
about writing a book, but I wrote all the time just for fun. I would write. I have binders of writing from like my half-baked book ideas because I just liked writing. I liked figuring out um, how to tell a story and the right words to exactly convey a certain, sentiment. And I think in metaphors a lot. Like you can ask my graduate students, I'm always like, this reminds me of this like strange metaphor. And I don't have a good, and then it's like we pick up like what that could possibly mean in terms of an experimental manipulation. Yeah.
Yeah. Your answer there is interesting because it kind of maps on very closely to how I feel about things. Where I similarly, like, I have not done it, but there is the part of me that would like to write a book comes from that same place of like when I was in college, the thing that actually introduced me to social psychology were these books that were coming out at the time, right? Stumbling on Happiness, Predictably Irrational, right? Those were the kind of the foundation that kind of showed me, oh, there are these cool things that we can know about people and we can know them in this way, and sort of build big ideas about how the world works. But the question then that I have, like as an aspirational writer, is to think, well, when does the time come to pull the trigger, right? And you sort of loosely said when it was such that there was enough to say. But like, what did that feel like? Is there, or if you were to frame it differently, to give advice to someone to say like, well, you should probably not think about doing this until blank. What is that until moment?
Yeah, and I always hesitate to give actual tangible advice about this because everyone's in a different situation, and there are certain departments that want you to have a book, right? Like if
Mm,
you're going to go up for tenure at Harvard, for example, they like
mm,
you to have some popular book before you go up. And there's people who have published books before tenure and then gone on to be, to get tenure and be very successful, like Adam Alter. Um, but my thinking was always like, I want to wait till after tenure, that I thought that I should be focusing mostly on academic publications. That said, so Frank Flynn and I had explored the possibility of writing a pop psych book, and that would have been not just me, but like, both of us. So it wasn't entirely on me, years before, and it just never came to anything in the end. So it's not like I officially waited till tenure, but there was just a point where I was like, okay, I have tenure. I feel like I could take a little bit of a risk. I feel like I can spend time on something that I don't really know how much time it's going to eat up and probably will take away from my research. I feel like I'm in a position now where I feel more established, and I feel like I trust my research that I have something to say. Like, I definitely didn't want to write a book, like a whole big pop psych book on stuff I wasn't almost 100% sure was like,
Mm.
replicable and all these things. And so at that point, I was like really confident in my studies. And I mean, I think I also had started doing more popular science writing, and that really helped me to get a sense of like, okay, I do enjoy this. I have some ideas. People resonate with these kinds of ideas. So I think I had tested the water a little bit and felt like, okay, I've done enough of that to know that I could do, or at least I think I could do like a whole book on this.
Hmm. So the idea occurs to you that like now is the time. And what is the idea at the time? Like, it becomes what it becomes, but that seed was what?
You know what's funny is actually, so I guess another sort of impetus for writing the book was that, so Heidi Grant wrote a book called Reinforcements that talks about a ton of my research, and it's on asking for help. And I felt for a long time like I could write a book on asking for help. And then Heidi wrote her book, and I was like, I kind of feel like that space it has been covered now. I don't now looking back and seeing how it works, I don't necessarily think that was true, but I felt like she had done such a good job of covering it, and I didn't want to say a lot of the same things. And so my other sort of thought, and then I started working with Erica Boothby, who's got this amazing research that's pretty different from mine, but has a similar sort of idea behind it, which is that we don't recognize the influence we have on people. Um, I just felt like, oh, wait, if I combine the work I'm doing with her and her work and my work, like I have a different perspective that's not like the book Heidi wrote, that's not just about asking for things, but it's about, underestimating your influence more broadly. And at that point, I really did feel like someone else couldn't write this book. Like, this is sort of my book to write. Like, I have an idea that's different from what's come before, that's not just the same way I've talked about my work forever. Yeah, and so actually I did look back, again, figuring you would ask me some questions about this, but I look back at the very initial super early draft of the book proposal I
Hmm.
wrote and I sent to an agent who I had already known, actually through Frank and my failed attempt at doing a
Mm.
book years ago. Um, and I sent it to him, and the whole framing is exactly what the book wound up being. Like, I just
Hmm.
had such a clear idea of like, this is what it is. Um, so yeah, it was really, it was definitely this idea of like, you're not as ineffective or uninfluential as you think you are. Yeah.
Hmm. And so that sort of tips us into that next stage of things, which is actually going out and making it happen. So once the idea is there, what is sort of the next step toward kicking this wheel into motion?
Yeah. So I kind of decided on the topic. I was like, this is what the book's going to be about. And sort of this is generally what I'm going to have in the book. And then I started drafting what the chapters would look like, because a big question I had, I mean, and this is my process, and I think other people have different ones, obviously. A big question was like, is there enough there for a book? So I was just trying to think like how many chapters, like actually, like, worthwhile chapters could I fill? And so I did an outline of each chapter, some examples, some like, poppy examples I could use, some of the studies
Hmm.
I would cite. And then I actually wrote the intro. Again, I was like testing the idea myself. It was like I was just like trying to see like, could I write this in a way where I'm like, yes, this makes sense. This could be a book. So I just did it and tried it. And then that's the sort of scrappy little proposal that I sent to my agent at the time, who I had already known. In that case, that would be a time where if you didn't already have a connection to an agent, you would, start reaching out to, I say, friends and colleagues to find an agent. I think that probably makes more sense than just like cold calling. Although in our field, you publish something interesting and
Mm-hmm.
agents will sometimes just cold call you and be like, have you ever thought of writing a book?
Mm.
That's happened a couple times.
Like publish something
And
interesting in a journal, or you're talking like in a popular press outlet?
more often in a popular press, but I've heard of other people who just like they're looking for content to
Hmm.
represent. And so they just find people who are doing interesting work. I think they often come to people through these, either media coverage or popular writing that you've done. That's when I've been approached. It's been like, after I wrote a New York Times article or something.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, but I do think in general, it makes the most sense to like ask around and get an introduction, because then you do need an agent. And usually an agent, at least mine and the ones who have cold called me have explained to me, they work with you to develop a really strong proposal. So you start with like your little scrappy idea, and then they help you come up with the strongest proposal you could come up with, because that's what you then go on to sell to the actual, publisher.
Hmm. And what does that proposal look like? Like, how fleshed out is the final set of ideas, or is it like an abstract, or I mean, somewhere in between?
It's pretty, as far as and again, okay, so I'm just gonna put this caveat out there so I don't have
Hmm.
to say it every time. I have done this once,
Uh-huh.
and so I've talked to other people, I've seen other people's proposals, so I have a little bit of sense of, like, similarities and differences in
Hmm.
different places, but, like, I definitely I've done this once, but so I think, especially this is my understanding from my agent, is that especially for first-time authors, you want your proposal to be pretty fleshed out. So they typically want a full draft of one chapter,
Hmm.
not the intro. So I had my intro drafted, not realizing that wouldn't like count as my
Hmm.
chapter. So then I had to write another chapter. And the outline for the first time is usually pretty extensive. So each chapter, so it was like I had a full intro, a full chapter, and then for each chapter that wasn't written, I had 2 pages drafted, basically explaining exactly what was going to be in the chapter. And so it was pretty well drafted out. And actually, I was so thankful later on that it was that detailed, because that's how I wrote the book. Like,
Hmm.
the book is almost exactly the proposal. And I just, whenever I would get stuck or be like, what do I do next? Or,
Hmm.
I had it in my proposal. I went back to my proposal. Oh yeah, I was going to write this example. So I write that example, it
Hmm.
was so helpful. And then in that proposal, there's also a section where you put your comp titles. So those are like titles that you would compare your book to, which are almost always things like Atomic Habits and
Hmm.
like
Oh, sure,
Grit,
sure. So
like
you're saying
something
other
super
books that
fun.
exist that yours would sort of
Yeah,
be in the same interest group. Got it.
exactly. So you're like, okay, this is the next, How to Win
Right.
Friends and Influence People, with a twist of,
Uh-huh.
um, you know, I, I can't remember. I think Zoe Chance's was like with like Quiet meets Dale Carnegie,
Mm. Yeah, it
So you
sounds
want to
like
pick like
every
the
pitch is
biggest
that. You
thing.
just like, here are the two things that are already successful, and mine is unique because it's not only one of them, but it's two of them.
Exactly. Yeah. So you do that, and then you have a page where you talk about yourself and like why you are the person to write this book.
Hmm.
And that's where you can also include, and I think it's helpful to include like anything you've written. So, popular press articles, press coverage, something that shows that like I
Hmm.
can also promote this book,
Hmm.
basically.
And then you have I mean, of course, it's only your story, but what was like, how many places does this proposal go to? Is it all in one? Is it like I mean, it's not like a journal where you submit it and you sit on your toes for 3 months and then go to the next place, or do you just blast it out to a bunch of places?
Yeah, so there's different ways to do this. And in the end, the road I took was pretty different from the road most people take.
Hmm.
So I think most commonly what happens is the book goes to auction,
Hmm.
which means that your agent basically sends the proposal to a few different publishers. And if more than one is interested, then the agent, whoever it is, in my case, he will say, okay, by X date, send me your bids, and then we'll decide from those bids. And so that's
Hmm.
like the auction. And then several things can happen. You can get what's called a preempt. So basically, someone could say, before this auction, I'm going to offer like a super high bid that you would be silly to turn down. And so I'm going to get the book. And so a lot, like if someone gets like a preempt, it's usually for a higher amount of money, but then it didn't ever go to auction. It was just someone, grabbed it off the shelf before it actually went to auction.
Hmm.
Sometimes they get sold at book fairs. I don't exactly understand how that happens. I don't know if it's,
Not the
like,
book fair
basically
that I went to in second grade, right?
not like the Scholastic, like yeah, book fair where you get those little floppy books. Um, yeah, but it's not like the London Book Fair and the
Hmm,
Frankfurt Book Fair, I think are the big ones, and sometimes an agent will take them there and, pass them around or have meetings there with publishers. My case was actually different from any of those because I went in, which is funny because like years later, now having written and published the book, I have to look back and remind myself I made these choices. But
hmm,
I was like, I care about making full professor. I care about being at a publisher that, like, looks like a pseudo academic publisher, but isn't
hmm,
like, Oxford, like OUP or something, but is like a more like people would look at it and think, "Oh, that could be an academic book that
hmm,
is like a really top publisher." Like I wanted to have a certain status or prestige with the publisher. And so my agent was immediately like, "You want Norton." And he was like, "I know someone there who I think will like this book." And
hmm,
so he sent it to her exclusively and just said, like, "We'll give this to you without showing it to anybody else for a couple weeks," which is a trade-off. I mean, then they're not competing, so they
hmm,
can, offer you hopefully a fair amount, but like it's not gonna be as much as if you go to auction or something and they're competing with
hmm.
other people. Um, but in that case, like, it was just such a good fit, and so she took it, and it was, like, the most chill way of selling a book compared to so many other people's stories. Because it was like that, you turn it into, like, a journal, get, like, super easy feedback,
Mhm.
and 2 weeks later, someone gives you money, so, like
So that was the only publisher who even looked at the proposal, was Norton?
yeah.
Wow,
Mhm.
nice. So you got the deal. Now it's time to actually write this thing. Um, and so for folks who are interested in sort of beefing up their writing skills outside of the kinds of writing we usually do, I'm wondering, because you did so much popular writing beforehand, are there lessons you learned in that experience that you took to the book writing process with you?
Definitely. I mean, I think I wound up treating each, little section of each chapter because the chapter is broken down into like little, subsections as basically like an op-ed essay, like
Mm,
each one. So it was the same kind of idea, like draw the reader in with a example that resonates, give them a sense of like why you're even talking about this and where you're going, give them the evidence and then sort of conclude like the more sort of formulaic op-ed kind of thing. That's definitely the way I wrote a lot of the sections, and it had helped to have experience doing that and to
mm,
have my work edited, doing that, because I got to see like, oh yeah, my sort of inclination is to write like this, but
mm,
editors keep changing the beginning to this.
mm,
Um, so yeah, I thought that that was super helpful. I even used some of the like for some places, like I'd written for the conversation, and you can repurpose
mm,
the anything you write there, kind of anywhere as long as you credit them, basically. And so I actually used some things I had written like right in the book, which was helpful
mm.
as well.
Are there things? So you mentioned like you got experience being told that your inclination is not the right one. Is there anything that you would say like, oh, one of the lessons I pulled from that is to do this instead of that?
Yeah, and I don't know how much this fits into a book because I think you're given more leeway in a book, I think. But like a big thing is like the whole giving it all away in the beginning. Like
Mm,
there's a sense of like I want to lead you there, but like, every time I've written an op-ed, they just like put it all in the first couple lines, or I'm just
mhm.
like, oh yeah, I got there, like in paragraph 3. Um, so I don't know how much that really is the case for books, but maybe, yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, another thing, so here's something, this is just like a sort of psychological switch I had to do with popular writing because in academic writing, you want to like placate everybody. Like you want to make sure you've addressed every possible counter argument and, every possible other explanation. And in popular writing, you just can't do that and tell a clean story. And you don't want to be inaccurate. Like, obviously, we all want to represent the science accurately, but you do have to weed out a lot of that nuance and a lot of those caveats. Like, otherwise, it just doesn't tell a clear story. And so I really had to remind myself, especially with popular writing, that you are one perspective amongst many perspectives out there. And I always tell myself that. I'm like, when I'm like, you know what? I don't know. I just wrote this very compelling argument, but I have like several counter arguments. I'm like, but this essay is this argument. If you were to take this argument, and make it as strong as possible, this is the argument you would make. And I've had to kind of let go of that urge to argue against myself, which I think is really good in academia. You always want to keep challenging your assumptions, but it's more like a debate almost. Like, I'm debating one side. This is the side I've chosen. I'm gonna write an essay like that. And so I in the book too, like when I would be spinning, sometimes being like, I don't, I have 5,000 caveats I want to add. And sometimes I would add some caveats, but like it was just drowning out the message. I had to tell myself, like, there are other books that are going to argue different things, but your book is arguing this, and you are making this as strong as possible. And it's one perspective, and you don't have the responsibility to like tell every single perspective,
When I talked to Dan Pink for this, he gave an analogy that I thought kind of captures what you're saying and really changed the way I thought about popular writing, which is, he started out in law and as a lawyer. And so he was like, there are prosecuting and defense attorneys, and they have different goals, right? And I don't know my law well enough to know which side he said that he does, but it's like, one approach is to just absolutely prove conclusively that something is true. The other is just to sort of present like a very plausible, well-founded, thought-out premise, but you don't need to like spell it out perfectly in order to make that case. And he says, that's kind of what popular writing is. It's like, I'm presenting you with some idea, right? And I'm going to show you all the ways in which this idea makes total sense, the implications this idea has, but I'm not trying to prove a truth of the universe. I'm just sort of trying to present a plausible perspective you can bring to the universe. And it kind of sounds like that's what you're saying too, right? Like that's the impetus is to be like, but let me make sure that every word that this book contains the truth versus this book contains an argument for one way of looking at things.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. And I think, especially because, we're trying to be careful post replication crisis. Like we want to present things accurately. We don't want anything to be wrong, but you are going to make leaps in a pop psych book. Like not everything is going to be exactly substantiated by 5,000 replicable studies. And ideally they would be. And I love like Jamil Zaki has got such a wonderful index where he says like, here's some claims I'm making that I'm super confident about. Here's some that I'm a little less confident about. So he like actually gives you like a sort of a coding system to know where he's like maybe jumping a little bit more. So I love the way he did it, although that's very time intensive to actually go through and code everything. But I think I kind of, after writing this book and then like reading so many books in a different light and thinking about like what I take from pop science books, it is a perspective. I don't assume that they're proving their point. Like, Dan Pink was saying, it's not like 100% like everything in this book is true about what the universe is like, and there's no other perspectives. And this is the 100% truth. You don't want it to be inaccurate again, but you want it to make you think. And sometimes, you stretch things a little bit, or you try to say, if this were true, like think about all the things that might also be true. And there is no proof for those things, but those are the things that people are going to actually reflect on and care about. And so it does take a shift in going from like, oh my God, replication crisis, I'm terrified. And I did make sure that like the studies I cite were strong. And I feel like, for the most part, they're replicable. When they weren't, I tried to note that. So it's not about that, but I definitely also say, like, draw conclusions or suggest ways of thinking about things that there's not exact proof in that domain necessarily, right? But I felt like I had to become okay with that. And I did wind up becoming okay with that.
Related to that too is like, a book is not just a list of studies either, right? Like you're not even just constraining yourself to the things that we can feel very, very confident about. Even if we're, only selecting on studies we're very confident about, that's still not like a book. A book is a bigger thing. And the thing I remember that always impressed me when I would read these popular press books in like college would be like, where are these where are they getting all these stories from? Like, they're talking about research. I get where they know that stuff, right? Like, that's their job. But throughout all of these, hundreds of pages, there are these anecdotes that just so like neatly tie in with what they're saying. And I've always been curious, like, what the process is for collecting the like scientifically empirical evidence and leaning on these more anecdotal or descriptive pieces of evidence.
Yeah, that's such a good question because that is the thing I struggled with the most too. Each time I had to write about a study, I was like, I got this.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to read the article and I'm going to write what happened and we are good. Um, and it's funny, I think, yeah, here's the classic, like, don't read the reviews about your book. But I have read people say things like, it feels like some of the experiments are like drawn out too much or like filler. And it probably is like, that's where I felt most comfortable. I was like, I can write this all day. And finding the stories was definitely a harder part. And that is where a lot of my preceding science writing, really helped out. And also just talking to people. So even like the few podcasts I had been on prior to the book and the interviews I had done with the media prior to the book, you just start realizing the things people think that you can talk about. They'll be like, hey, here's this thing that happened in the news. Can you comment on it? And it's like, I would have never thought of that myself necessarily, but like, yeah, I think I could actually kind of analyze that. And so that gets you in the mindset where you start seeing things like in the news. You start knowing the things that you're looking for. And it just takes time, right? Like once you're in the headspace of like, I'm writing about this, and then you start seeing everything in that headspace. And it's like now when the TV comes on and I'm watching a show, I hear a quote and I write that down because it's like, what I've been thinking about right now. So yeah, I think it takes time and observation, being sort of in that space, letting it just come while you observe the world and talking to people. I mean, so many of that, I had never thought about like how I might explain like the Tinder swindler, right? And then our media person was like, hey, people keep asking me about this. I feel like it has something to do with social influence and persuasion. Do you think that you could write something about that? And I was like, let me think about it for a minute. And I was like, oh my God, I totally write about some of these things in my book. And so, but I wouldn't have made that connection until someone else did.
That's a nice example where there was a connection to make. I've occasionally gotten emails from the Ball State communication people. They're like, we want to know about this. And I go, I'm not your guy. That's like so not what I have anything to say about.
Yeah.
But occasionally those will align. And you go, well, now that you say it, there is maybe a way to frame this in the context of what you know. So in terms of writing, right? Pulling off a book is different than pulling off other kinds of writing that we do. And it's sort of a long game. Like, do you have a sense of like from page 1 to your last comfortable page of like the draft you'd said, like, this is the full first draft. What did that timeline look like?
So as I said, the proposal, I had already written the intro and a chapter. So if you count that, it was about, since the start of the proposal until we sold it, it was about 4 months of like refining the proposal. And so that, if you count that and add it, it was that plus 18 months. So about 22 months, maybe a little bit less than that. I think I actually strangely turned it in early. But I actually, when we sold it, I was given 12 months to write the book and thought that was just normal. And then I went to this pop author panel here at Cornell with Catherine Kinsler and Tom Gilovich and Kate Mann, all of whom have published, pop psych books or pop philosophy books. And they were like, all of them had gotten 18 months. And so I went back to my agent and I was like, I feel like I should have gotten 18 months. And so he pushed for it. I think I wound up getting like 17 months, even after we had sold it. But yeah.
And so what did the days within those months look like? Like how much of your time is going to this book? I imagine that it probably is in cycles and shifts. It's not like, well, for 20 minutes every day, even if that's part of your strategy, probably not always how it pans out. So like in terms of actually pulling this off, again, the odd thing is that academics who are writing these books are doing it in the context of like a job they already are committed to, right? They're not just sort of professional authors and they're like, well, this is my job now, is to write this book. So in terms of actually accomplishing this pretty big writing project, how do you pull that off?
Yeah. And, I know there are times when I would just force myself to do the whole like write for an hour in the morning every day for like this amount of time or something. But everyone's different, but my style is definitely that I get into I just have this like moment of inspiration and then write like all day without stopping and potentially night and the next day. Um, and then like take a break. So I tend to write very much in bursts, where I could just get a whole bunch down. Like I think I wrote the intro like in a day or two, and it never basically changed hardly at all. Um, but I mean, as you said, it just so much depended. Like there was a summer in there, and the summer looks very different where I could spend a lot of time, writing all day. And then in when I was teaching, it would be like in the evening, and I would usually just force myself like for an hour in the evening after the kids go to bed, to just, read an article I know that I want to write about or something. And usually in reading it, I would start summarizing it. Like I would pick something pretty easy that just felt like the workhorse of the book, like just, you want to write about this study, read the study, summarize it, go to bed. And my editor, so she said for first time authors, she liked to work by like we would come up with deadlines per chapter. It started out with like one chapter at a time, but we ended up changing it to like two chapters at a time. I can't remember exactly why, but it just worked better. So I never felt like, oh, I'm writing the book right now. It felt like, okay, I'm writing chapter one, and chapter one is due this date, or like I'm writing chapters 1 and 2 and they're due this date. And then even within that, like I was saying earlier, like I was like, I'm writing the subsection about this, or I'm writing, like I very much chunked it. I'm writing this anecdote from the proposal. I never really thought of it. It was, if I were to equate it to something academics do, it's like very similar to writing a dissertation, I think, because that's just such a long-term thing. But for me, it was like, I really chunked it. It was like, I'm writing this study now, and then later I'm writing this other thing.
The dissertation analogy makes sense too, because you do kind of know where it's going, right? When you embark, right? When you have the data in, at least you go like, okay, like I have a sense of the story that needs to be told here. And there are like identifiable chunks within that, right? So like, I'll write up the method for this study today. I'll write up the results for this study today. And that is probably a pretty adaptive way to go about the process, rather than every day think like, okay, I'm going to write another 0.5% of the book today. So I'm going to write a whole 100% of this section of the book today. Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to talk to you also about promotion, which is kind of how we started. And so, I like you said, you haven't counted, but it's a number. I remember when I was in first grade and I was doing some reading thing at the library, and they just could not be bothered to actually count the number of books I read. I got my certificate that said I had read umpteen books. So you've read umpteen. You've given all of these interviews, and so what has that been like?
Yeah, I mean, all right, the whole thing is weird once you're done with the book, because you really just think about the book, right? Like, and once it's done, then there's all this time until it comes out, and you're meeting with, your PR person, either through the publisher, or if you hire like a private separate one. And I had both working with me at the time. And they schedule you on all these podcasts and try to get you interviews, and some of them tape before the book comes out so that they'll actually come out, when the book comes out. And yeah, it's, I had been on podcasts before, like yours and, and even Hidden Brain. So I had a little bit of experience, but it felt so different being on so many in such a short period of time, where you just literally get so sick of hearing yourself speak. Like That's the hardest part, I think. You're like, "Am I saying the same thing again?" Like, I can't
Hmm.
stand the sound of my own voice anymore.
And did I say this already to you, or was that the one this
Yeah.
morning?
And the thing is, it's that classic thing where, like, these listeners presumably are hearing this
Hmm.
for the first time. This host is hearing this for the first time, at the very most, probably the second time, maybe if they heard one other podcast you were on. So they're not as bored, and you can just say the same stuff, but it just feels like you should change things each time because you feel like you're boring everybody, but it's just expected that you keep saying, like, your same spiel. It reminded me
Hmm.
of what I mean, obviously on a very, very different scale, and I'm not equating myself to, like, some movie star or something, but it reminded me of the junkets that the press
Hmm.
junkets they go out and do where they say the same things every time. And if you catch them on, like, Letterman and, like, some other late
Hmm.
night, they're giving the same anecdotes and everything. But it was very much like that. Yeah.
And even literally, like they'll be in a room. I mean, pre-COVID, right? They'll be in a room, and press people just kind of filter in and out to get the quotes for their stories. And it's just like,
Yeah.
man, just make a press release that everyone can borrow from.
I
Uh,
kept thinking, like, can one person just tape my answers and
right.
just play them on all these podcasts? I don't understand.
Yeah, yeah. It's the reason why for Opinion Science, I really try to catch people before they go on that, right? Like if
Mhm.
I know a book is coming out, I try to grab someone really early in the process before they've had a chance to like get sick of what they're saying. Because it's also just less interesting to talk to someone when you know, like, yeah, what could I possibly say that you haven't already responded to? So, I mean, are there, in order to keep it interesting for you, is it really just like put your head down and make it happen? Or are there things you would do to approach these interviews to keep it interesting on your own?
That's a good question. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're, looking most of the time at someone through a screen and they're a new person and they seem genuinely interested and like they clearly are at least not acting like they've ever heard any of these things before, you can definitely get back into it. You could be surprising yourself. I think sometimes I'm just like, wow, like this is still an interesting thing to say, like even though I've heard it a million times, but this person seems really interested. So I think a host that shows a lot of enthusiasm, it doesn't really it's still fine. Like it's pretty easy to just be human. Um but yeah, I think I had to remind myself a lot that like this person is hearing it for the first time. Um and there's also it's kind of a U curve, right? Because in the beginning, you're still working out your talking points. You're like, what is the best way to talk about this? Then you find out that actually when you use this analogy or this anecdote or whatever, that people really seem to get that and like, lock on to that. And so you start using that later and you get better and you feel more confident. And then it's like now you've used it a million times and then you start getting tired of it again. So it's just up and down. To some extent, it is just a slog, but, I don't know, it's hard to tell before every interview, it's like you have no idea how it's gonna go when you start talking to someone, and there's a big difference. Like, one thing that I was surprised by is how different levels of preparedness play into it. Like, there are some people who clearly read the book really closely, who have great, thoughtful, deep questions. There's some people who clearly did not read it. There's some people who tell you they didn't read it. And in the end, you still have like the same answers, but there is a different vibe.
Do you get more sick of talking about the first two chapters? So I say this because what was it? I think I had read Jennifer Eberhardt's book Biased a few years ago, and she has like a great anecdote on like page 10. And every interview I saw her give, that's the thing that they asked about. And I was like, I just think everyone read the first chapter and then they jump to that rather than, the guts of the book. Most of the folks are not reading that deep into it. I mean, did you find anything like that where there's like little clues where you go, I think you only read to page 15.
Well, there were literally people who would say, I'm only on chapter 2, and I'm like, "You're never gonna get past chapter 2." Like, um, but yes, and the clue with my book was that, the first half of it is about like, yay, influence, you have so much of it, use it. And then the second half is all about using it responsibly. And so anyone who was like, yeah, so just ask for things, like just, like only, I was like, I feel like you didn't read the second half of the book where it was like, there's a whole other second lesson to take from this. And it's fine because I feel like the first half was more like poppy, but there were definitely moments where I was like, you didn't keep reading and see like where I was going with that.
Does it seem worth it? Right? Like you did all these. Now that you've done them, and you say you're obviously still doing some of them as they sort of popcorn out, does it, like, to what degree would you say like this was an important part of the process versus this was the part of the process I was told I had to do?
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to figure that out. I do enjoy it, like, when it's not so overwhelming. In the beginning, it was very exciting because it was, like, the first couple weeks the book was out, so it was overwhelming, but it was also exciting, and then it gets a little more tiring and draining, and then now that I don't have as many, I'm more like, "Where is everyone? Why don't they wanna talk to me about my book?" Like, so it's kind of fun again. Um, I mean, like I said earlier, I think that it has solidified a lot of things that are like, I put a bunch of stuff in the book, and hearing what resonates with people like gives me information about like what's most interesting about some of the things that, I talk about or I research. And so that's been really helpful actually. Um, it helps me talk to my students, helps me talk to other people, it helps me think about my research and gives me a little more confidence when I'm like, I think this is interesting, but there's no theoretical real reason for it, but it's like practically interesting. In terms of like sales and things like that, I have no idea. And there's so many small podcasts that like definitely don't do anything for sales. So it's like I don't really know if it's an important part of that process.
Hmm. Did you have a lot of autonomy in saying yes or no to them, or was it really these things would end up on your schedule based on the PR person coordinating?
Well, I hired a private PR person, and so I felt like anything that she asked, I should pretty much do unless I was like, I mean, and her whole thing, and I really, really liked her, was, if I'm suggesting it, I've already vetted it and I think it's worth it. So I was like, I trust her. And it wasn't, I mean, in the end, it's time. And I know time, like, there's all sorts of arguments about how important time is, but it felt like, especially because I don't have to travel somewhere, it was like, okay, so, is it really that hard to just hop on a podcast for an hour or something? So I pretty much said yes to everything, almost everything. There were a few where it was like, I just have too many this week. It's overwhelming. And this is just, yeah, too much. But
So when all is said and done, knowing what you know now, would you do it again? Would you write another book?
definitely. I mean, I would write this book again. I am thinking about writing a second book, but I'm trying to figure out like why. What would the reason be? So I really enjoyed the writing process. It's not easy, there were painful moments, but like for the most part, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed thinking through some of these things and putting them in long format and being able to like, as we were talking about earlier, like draw some like connections and, suggest some implications that I think are interesting to chew on, but wouldn't fit. Like I probably wouldn't be able to say them in like a journal article necessarily. And also just like to help me process my own path of research and what I see. So basically I really enjoyed that. If there was another topic where I was like, I'd really like to spend a year and a half writing about that and exploring it, I would definitely do it in a heartbeat. But it's like a matter of finding that thing and also just thinking about like, I think for me, it would have to be just like the pleasure of actually writing it because after all the stuff is like, I don't know, I mean, looking at like sales and things is depressing. And I mean, talking to people is fun, but it is a bit of a slog. And, you know, I feel like the goal wouldn't be like to be a bestseller or something because that's just like such a hard goal to have and ever like have it come true. So it would really have to be like there's some reason, some topic I really care about that I want to write about.
Yeah, it seems like there's a little bit of a, musician's second album issue where this book started in grad school, right? Like you were doing these studies early in your career and you built, basically, I mean, where you are now is sort of on the foundation of the line of work that ended up in the book. And not to say you haven't done other things, but it's like, if that's sort of the core line, then you go, okay, everything I've done is in this book. So what would what would another one even look like, right? It would have to be so different, because it couldn't be another like, oh, well, here's just this other, long history of work that I've been doing, and I'll write the book about this one now. So I could see where that challenge comes from, of like, okay, wow, all right, well is empty now. We'd have to find what to fill it with.
And I actually have thoughts for another book, but it is at that point where it's like, it would be a book about other people's research I really like, and like the patterns I see in it. And then I have to just think about, like, am I the person to write that? Do I have a unique enough take on that to be able to write about it? And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. Like, I was drafting a proposal just, again, for fun, because I actually enjoy it. I was like, I don't know if this is really going to go somewhere. But yeah, and I feel like I have a sense of what it could be, but then I'm struggling with the, like, is that my book to write? I don't know.
Well, I will keep my eye out to see if that book ever comes out. But in the meantime, thanks for walking us through the process that this takes and your experience with it.
Sure. Thank you so much. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you so much to Vanessa Bohns for sharing her experience and giving us the lowdown on popular science writing as a full-time social scientist. Check out the notes for this episode at opinionsciencepodcast.com, where you'll find links to Vanessa's website, her book, and other good stuff. This series on science communication is a special presentation of my podcast, Opinion Science, a show about the science of our opinions, where they come from, and how they change. You can subscribe any old place where they have podcasts. Yeah, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. You can go old school like I still do and get it right from the RSS feed. And you can help spread the word about the podcast and this science communication series in particular by sharing it on social media, emailing it to your fellow scientists, science writers, journalists, your children, and leaving kind reviews of the show online. Okie doke. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with something a little different. A lot of science communication involves interviewing experts. It's like the main thing I do for this podcast. And I got to interview an expert on interviewing. It was a real thrill to meet someone whose voice I'd actually been hearing for almost 15 years by listening to his podcast, his show on the radio. Jesse Thorne is the host of Bullseye on NPR, and he knows a lot about the craft of interviewing.
The two biggest problems that I see hear with people who write questions are one which is relatively small, the thing that I said, which is it sounds stiff, it sounds phony. There is one other thing, which is it makes everything stiff. It makes it so that when something interesting happens, you can't get more of that because you're on to the next thing on the list.